one thing I wanted to talk about, and this one's a lot more complicated, but details on the assisted suicide topic. And one thing I want to kind of find out, because I know a lot of people are in favor of assisted suicide, but there's so many caveats that should probably be factored in. 17 of the 17 of the 27 voted yes on assisted suicide, and three are undecided. So only seven no's. Um, is there anybody here that thinks there shouldn't even be a waiting period? If you're 18, you can basically go in the suicide booth.
With
No.
some stipulations, sure.
Okay, so let's start with you, Eric. Do you think how long of a waiting period is the smallest waiting period you think any adult should have for assisted suicide?
Any adult, that complicates it. So I
Like if
I
somebody
think that
applied in
generally,
our society, if
I see what
somebody
you mean.
applied for assisted suicide, what is a situation that you think would need the smallest wait period?
Terminal illnesses, severe injuries, uh, life-altering events that lead somebody to be like unable to return. So like there's a story out of the UK about a guy who left a girl because she was abusing him. She convinced him to come home with her, and then she dumped acid on him. And it was so bad that the doctors wouldn't release the pictures, which is actually really rare. They kept him in a hospital in hospice for a month. He was so disfigured that his own father didn't recognize him, and his family had to break him out of that hospital to take him to another country. It's one that starts with a B that's in Europe to get him assisted suicide. He shouldn't have
Mm.
had that waiting period. There was no way he could come back from that. It was something like 90% of his body had chemical burns on it, down to the third
Oh
degree.
wow.
He should have been allowed to get that immediately because there's no bouncing back from that. He would just suffer until he died. That's why he was on hospice. Those kinds of things, you should not have any kind of waiting period. If you find out you have terminal cancer, you can't cure it. If you want to go out, you should be allowed to go out. So
Okay.
I don't know that there should be much of a waiting period for that. If it's something that
Would
can
you
be
say 24
altered,
hours? Would you say
24
that
hours
it's
is a good waiting period.
okay? Cool. So in some cases, 24 hours, nothing under 24 hours. Okay. Would you say, and after this, I'll go up to Travis. Eric, would you say that there should be a imagine this is happening in the US, is there a certain number of people, well, don't worry about professions right now, is there a certain number of people that would have to sign off on it?
Not in my preferential world. No,
Okay,
that should be a personal choice.
got you. My concern with needing the people to sign off on it is because we're allowing something to be government allowed death, which is the government's probably top job is to protect us, to make sure that nobody is committing murders and calling them assisted suicide. So I think there needs to be maybe some set of like in the US, it would be something like you need at least
I think it could
two,
be
but
like a
probably
notary,
more. Yeah,
like a
yeah. I
witness.
don't know if you need at least one psychiatrist, one medical doctor, one governor or mayor, or yes, something to make sure that there that enough. I don't know. Anyways, I'll stop rambling. Travis, what are your thoughts? Maybe a quick version of a few ideas on assisted suicide.
Yeah, so when I voted um on that policy, I just voted yes because I was under the assumption that such a policy would naturally come with some sort of regulations on it. Like I'm not aware of any place where you can just get an assisted suicide and there's literally no regulation at all. So, yeah, I think
Okay.
there would have to be some form of regulation on it. Um, I think maybe one topic that could be of interest here because it wasn't really clarified in the initial like wording is what are we allowing assisted suicide for? Like, is this
Hmm.
strictly for like physical health conditions, or would we also be including, like, for example, mental health in this
If
as
you
well?
if you were the emperor for the day or for the lifetime, what would you have it be? You personally, like, what would you allow? Would you allow everything, or would it be specific?
Well, I mean, I don't think you can allow like literally everything. Like someone just walks in and like there has to be some kind of limit. But I would think that there are certain mental health conditions that you should be able to qualify for assisted suicide for.
Okay. Okay, and then Jeremy, let's hop over to you. And I'm curious if somebody was turned 18, they came in and said they wanted assisted suicide. Let's say they don't even want to specify their reasons or any mental illness or any life altering anything. They just do not want to live anymore. Let's say there's some hypothetical, and you can elaborate on this part if you want, where there's a they're told that they have to go to a certain amount of psychiatrists, do a certain amount of things. 6 months later, this person still just does not want to live anymore, and but there's no specific reason, like Travis was talking about, like a reason. What would your thoughts be on that case?
I mean, the underlying ethics of suicide seem pretty straightforward. It might be difficult to figure out in some cases, especially if somebody might be lying. But the underlying ethics are that if there's a reasonable expectation that somebody's going to have a net negative life, such as a huge painful condition or degenerative disease, then it becomes a good thing. And if they're in the position of a lot of adolescents, young people who are experiencing some temporary emotional situation like a breakup or dropping out of school, where the reasonable expectation would be that their lives would get much better once they got over that, then suicide becomes a very bad thing. So in terms of the legality, then I think in the general defense of freedoms, the general argument in favor of freedom from a utilitarian or consequentialist perspective is that individuals usually know what makes them happy and what makes them suffer better than other people do. So usually by giving people freedom, you sort of more accurately reflect the happiness and suffering in the world, because who generally knows better about you than you. But in so many of these cases of suicide, I think what it comes down to, like politically, legally, if we're going to try to stop people from committing suicide, especially these young people in emotional situations, we're essentially saying we have reason to think that we have more knowledge about what your future happiness and suffering is going to be like than you do. You're mistaken about yourself right now. We have reasons to think that you will be a lot happier and have a lot less suffering than you are claiming to think you will have. So ultimately, the justification for restricting suicide is going to depend upon that. How good are our scientific reasons, our sociological reasons, and just our common sense reasons for thinking that a particular kind of person who thinks that their own future is clearly going to be negative, to tell them, no, we're pretty damn sure that you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
We got all this evidence from all these people that were in a situation just like you, and now maybe they jumped off a bridge and then instantly regretted it, and now they're so glad that it didn't work. And so we have all this evidence to say, like, no kid, usually it's kids, you're wrong about your estimation of your future, and we're right. And so the situations where I would think about legally restricting suicide and maybe trying to involuntarily commit somebody for a short period of time are going to be ones that are based upon the amount of evidence we have that they're making a mistake. about their own future prospects.
Gotcha. Okay. I'm
You want me to get on
going
that
to come
one?
back to you with a question, but yeah, Phil. So I mean, you just had a long talk on this, so I'm aware that you're mostly against it. So can you tell me the cases where you are in favor of it?
Well, I think to be entirely, Jeremy laid out the nuance that I entirely agree with. Right, what we're really saying is, we can't take back your death. We can't take back your suicide. Right, so it behooves us to have an abundance of caution to ever allow someone to decide to kill themselves in any kind of easy way, as opposed to committing them. I have, in my personal experience, when I think of suicide, I think of acquaintances who have killed themselves, or very close friends who have had family and friends who have killed themselves. And my experience with it has not been someone who has 90-degree burns, chemical burns throughout their body. It's not someone in hospice. I've seen people die slowly in hospice and think to myself, why are we making this person die over 2 weeks when it would be much more humane to just very peacefully allow assisted suicide in that case? But what I think of when I think of suicide are these people who are, deranged about how horrible life is. Like, they don't seem to have a particular reason to want to kill themselves, and yet they do. And that to me is a struggle that we have to stop. That we have to get people to just stop and smell the roses, go on a hike. I don't know what it takes. I'm not a medical expert. I'm not a psychiatrist, but highly emotional people who have their whole lives ahead of them should not be allowed to say, "Oh no, I'm totally convinced that life is terrible and I want to kill myself."
Yeah, man. I should say.
Can I ask you like a quick question?
Can I just hear what Jeremy was going to say though?
Oh, I just we're dealing with it. My nephew's friend, my nephew's 16. My nephew's friend killed himself just a couple of weeks ago in a small town high school of maybe about 300 students. So it's a huge impact for everybody. And he just took a bunch of pills because he had a fight with his girlfriend over the phone, and then talked to one of his friends who didn't take him all that seriously. And it's like a guy who is pretty popular and active and doing a bunch of stuff, and it generally seems like the kind of thing that was just an emotional wave coming over him that he'd never experienced before in his life, and not some kind of growing influence of chronic mental illness or anything like that, but just just some momentary thing that he didn't realize was momentary. And but then in that situation, what is the criminalization help? If he had failed in his attempt, what greater benefit would it do that the government had policy of like putting him in involuntary mental health confinement, as opposed to just his family and friends rallying around him? What would the criminal law accomplish? Probably not much, making it a crime. So I could see clearly it's morally wrong. It was morally wrong for him to do, it's morally wrong for people to think that would be something to encourage, because his life was almost certainly going to be so positive. If he had just gotten over that wave of emotion. But criminal law, putting somebody in jail because they attempted suicide and failed.
Well, yeah, in this case, we're talking about the assistant to them.
Yeah, so I guess that could be an interesting thing where if assistance is allowed,
somebody who's a little bit upset. And to lean back to the question, I want to, have you ever lived with depression, my man? Like just being real for a second. Because the way that you describe that as somebody who's like deranged about how bad the world is kind of strikes a pretty negative chord for me. It's like depression isn't, oh, I feel sad sometimes. It's fucking suffering. It's
Mhm.
being in a pit where you can't feel anything but anger or sadness
Mhm.
all day, every fucking day. It's not as simple as like, oh, somebody felt sad and they're deranged because they think their life is bad. People do it because they get pushed to a point where they can't hold on. I have attempted 3 times, and I finally got medicated, and I'm glad I did. I've lost many friends to it, but this rings very true, or not true. It rings very similarly to the conversations that I hear around this topic, where people go, "Oh, that person was selfish," and that always irritates the absolute shit out of me. So the reason I asked if you've had depression is because the way you talk about it sounds just so unempathetic that it just makes me so angry. So, how do you?
So the word derangement is what triggered you? Because I could have easily just said depression. Maybe
Derangement is
derangement's
a
the wrong word.
similar. Derangement and depression are not the same thing. It's the framing around the way you described it. It's not just the word. That word just sparked on top of it. It was a lot of things. It's just a
I think
fundamental misunderstanding of what
Eric,
it's like to fucking live with that.
Eric, I'm going to cut you off real quick. I don't need to speak for Phil. Phil can speak for himself. But I think the difference between us lawmakers discussing how we want to form a law is way different than if like Phil was with somebody that had depression and was talking about their situation. Phil's a great guy. I don't think he meant to come off callous or anything. But anyways,
No,
Phil,
I
go ahead
don't.
and
I
respond
don't.
to
I'm
that.
not
And after
implying that he did. It's just something that irritates me.
yeah, Phil, after you respond to that, I'm gonna ask Dillian a couple questions because he hopped in here. But Phil, go ahead and respond to Eric real quick.
No, I mean he can have his emotions about it, and those are 100% valid. So I don't have like any desire to argue or to say that the way he feels about how I sounded is that's fine.
Eric, this is really fast, but do you hold the view that mental illness just is a form of physical illness, full stop? That the social
No.
treatment of chronic mental illness should be the same as somebody who has like a painful degenerative non-mental illness?
It depends on the illness itself. Like my uncle has schizophrenia. I've been dealing with clinical depression since I was 8 years old. There are some things that like depression can affect you physically because it can just take away your will to do anything. Like it's more complicated than the way a lot of people frame it. It's I don't see it quite that way. There are plenty of physical ailments that can't really be treated that would be more apt to be included with assisted suicide. But like that's I just need to like I'm not gonna be able to answer your question right because like I'm tired and that just for some reason that just like sparked something for me. So that's the best I'm gonna be able to give you for a second.
Well, that's a cool thing about having these conversations, and we'll have more detailed ones. Like these couple days of talks are big groups, so it's hard to get on one-on-ones. But like for example, if we had a talk where it was you and Phil, or you and Jeremy, and then you guys each had like studies for why you feel different ways, then there'll be good opportunity for us all to like learn different aspects of each side, and which is hard to do when it's a big panel like this. But yeah, let's hop over to Dillian.
Actually, I wanted to ask one question about on this topic.
Yeah.
What about people who are clearly chronically suffering but don't have the mental capacity to consent to suicide or to decide that?
Interesting.
I just thought
I
about
think
it,
that
but
would fall
I
in the
don't have an
lines of
answer
like
to that.
power
I
of
just
attorney.
Yeah, I wonder if Travis would bite the ethical consequentialist bullet like I would too, and say that the relevant issue is not consent. It's reasonable prediction about the person's happiness or suffering in the future, and they're the ones people who are of sound mind are able to understand their own condition better than anybody else usually. But somebody who can't consent, it falls upon anybody else with the power over their life to decide whether they're going to have a life of net happiness or a life of net suffering based upon the medical evidence.
Yeah, let's
But
go to
what
Travis
if
on
what
this
if the
one,
life
and
is
then
should
what's up,
this
Dillian?
be an option is what I'm asking. What if you know that the life is absolutely going to be of net suffering?
Then we should kill that person.
Travis, let's hear your
Okay.
thoughts on that, and then let's jump to Phil on that.
Yeah, so I would agree with the kind of Peter Singer position, where I think he takes the view that if you have like certain infants who are going to have a very painful condition, they're going to have a short life. He takes the view that parents should have the legal option to basically euthanize their child to take them out of their misery. I would agree with something like that. I don't really see what good is done by just leaving the child there to suffer until they like die in a few weeks.
Yeah, I want to throw in a thought real quick before Phil answers. I just hadn't really thought about this much. I think there's a huge difference between so I think the most important thing about a society is protection from being killed. I think the idea of neglect is such a complicated topic that when it comes to something like this, I don't think anybody is owed being kept alive. I don't think anybody's owed being saved. In a society, we can decide children being owed by their parents to be kept alive. You can't, even if you're not killing this baby, you can't set it on a table and not feed it. You're obligated to do these different things. But when it comes to adults and the existence of medical care, I don't think anything is necessarily owed to a person. So if there's somebody that's suffering, that if it wasn't for the humans keeping them alive, then something like euthanizing them is just the better version of leaving that adult on a table suffering. Where if somebody can survive on their own, I guess that just wouldn't fall into the category of a person that is unable to give consent. So there's my 2 cents on it. But Phil, what are your thoughts on Dillian's question?
Well, in my opinion, if someone is able to express an fear of death, even if they don't fully appreciate that that the rest of their life is going to be misery, all that's really required is that someone doesn't want to die, and then I'm not interested in killing them ever.
Okay.
As far as that goes.
Gotcha. Okay, so if they can express in any way that they do not want to die, then of course you don't take them out of their misery, even if all of us think that they're suffering and need out of their misery. But if they don't express it, then you're just kind of up in the air on it.
There's
But
one more.
if it's someone who can't explicitly, doesn't have the capacity to explicitly say that, then their, I guess, aversion to death would be entirely instinctual.
I know that what we're talking about here would be sort of like the ethical ramifications of implied consent, and I would kind of be open to going either way on that. I'd imagine there's already been a lot of thought done on this subject, like the ethical ramifications of implied consent. So I would be willing to entertain, whatever seems to be the consensus on that issue, because I would really hesitate to kill someone who's not already, in addition to having a good reason to want to die, expressed the desire to die. But if they're not even conscious or not able to communicate and their whole life is suffering, maybe it is appropriate. I mean, that seems like there would be implied consent. I just, I'm speculating here though. I don't know.
Yeah, I'd also like to make the point that there's kind of a difference between like the principled position versus what we think would be best, practically speaking, to enact into law. Like I can think of certain hypothetical situations in which if someone is suffering to a certain degree, but they still want to live, there are certain hypothetical situations that I can think of where it might still be permissible or even good to kill them. But I mean, the question is, do we want to like put something like that into law? Like, do we think a law like that would have good consequences?
Gotcha.
Maybe it depends on how we formulate it.
Exactly.